Have you ever wondered what truly makes a person great? Not wealth, fame, or power, but something deeper. David's story offers an unexpected, and sometimes even controversial, answer. David, a simple shepherd boy, was chosen by God to become Israel's greatest king, despite all his flaws and weaknesses. This raises a fascinating question. How can someone so imperfect be called a man after God's own heart? This incredible journey starts in humble beginnings, with an unknown young man, and transforms into a tale filled with challenges, battles, and unexpected victories. But what stands out the most in David's life isn't the giants he defeated or the armies he led. It's his remarkable ability to turn back to God, even after his greatest mistakes. And this is something we can all relate to. How many times have we failed? How often do we feel small in the face of the mountains we have to climb? Like David, we can find strength not in our perfection, but in God's grace. Get ready to dive into one of the most inspiring stories in the Bible. A story that teaches us not just about courage and leadership, but about repentance, faith, and the transformative power of forgiveness. Follow along this journey and discover how David's story can become your own story of overcoming and hope. Life has this funny way of presenting us with challenges that seem way too big to handle, doesn't it? You know those moments when you're standing at the bottom of a mountain, staring up and wondering, how on earth am I going to get to the top? Well, that's exactly what David faced. Picture this, a young shepherd, barely a man, chosen by God for something far greater than anyone could have imagined. And just like us, David wasn't perfect. He had flaws, doubts, and struggles, yet God saw his potential. It's this contrast that makes his story so relatable. When we face our own giants, much like David, it's not about being the strongest or the most capable, but about having faith and determination to push through. Now, if you think about your own life, there's probably been a time when you felt utterly overwhelmed. Whether it was a big project at work, a family responsibility, or maybe even a personal goal that seemed too far out of reach. David's journey reminds us that even in those overwhelming moments, there's a higher plan at work. The key, trusting the process and, more importantly, trusting that the obstacles in front of us are opportunities in disguise. It's not always easy to see, but when we do, we start to grow in ways we never imagined. And as David learned from his humble beginnings, we, too, can learn from our struggles. Whether it's learning patience, resilience, or even compassion for others facing similar battles, there's always a lesson. David's story is a testament that greatness doesn't come from perfection, but from perseverance and faith. As we delve deeper into his life, we'll see how these principles played out in each step of his journey, from shepherd to king. David's story begins in a place that seems almost too humble for someone destined for greatness. Bethlehem wasn't a city known for producing kings or warriors. It was small, quiet, and overlooked. And yet, it's in this very setting that David learned the most important lessons of leadership. Being a shepherd may not seem like much, but it taught him the values of responsibility, care, and protection. He wasn't leading people at this stage, but the flock he guarded depended on him in ways that mirrored his future leadership of Israel. This was the foundation being laid for something much bigger. Imagine the daily grind of shepherding, constantly watching over the sheep, guiding them, protecting them from predators. David learned to be vigilant, patient, and brave. These qualities didn't just come out of nowhere when he faced Goliath later in life. They were honed during his time alone in the fields, away from the spotlight. Leadership isn't about the title or the recognition. It's about the actions taken when no one else is watching. It's in these small, unnoticed moments that character is forged. Then comes the moment that changes everything. The divine anointing. Samuel, the prophet, arrives, and David, the least expected, is chosen by God to be the future king. It's almost ironic, isn't it? His brothers, who seemed far more fit for the role, are passed over. This is a recurring theme in life. Sometimes, those who seem the least qualified are the very ones chosen to lead. Why? Because leadership is about heart, not just appearance or status. At the time of his anointing, David didn't immediately step into the role of king. Instead, he continued shepherding, continued serving, waiting for God's timing. This teaches us a crucial lesson. Just because you're called to something great doesn't mean it happens overnight. Sometimes, there's a season of preparation, a season where you're still in the fields, still learning, still growing. Patience in the process is key. How often do we rush the journey, eager to get to the destination, when in reality, the journey is what prepares us for the responsibility ahead. David's early years in Bethlehem remind us that greatness often starts in the most unexpected places. It's not about where you're from or what you have, but about how you handle the season you're in. For anyone feeling stuck or overlooked, David's story offers hope. You might be in a Bethlehem season right now, but it doesn't define your future. In fact, it could be the very foundation that sets you up for something extraordinary. Another key takeaway from David's time as a shepherd is how his leadership style began to take shape. He led with a servant's heart, putting the needs of his flock before his own comfort. This would later become a hallmark of his reign as king. True leadership is about serving others, even when it's inconvenient or challenging. In our own lives, we can apply this by seeking to lead with humility and a focus on the well-being of those around us, whether at work, at home, or in our communities. Additionally, being a shepherd taught David the value of solitude and reflection. In the quiet of the fields, he developed a deep relationship with God, one that would guide him through the most difficult moments of his life. Sometimes, it's in our quietest, most isolated moments that we grow the most spiritually. We should never underestimate the power of solitude for personal growth and reflection. Finally, David's anointing by Samuel was a clear sign of God's hand in his life, even when the world didn't recognize it yet. This can be comforting for us when we feel unseen or unappreciated. God's plans are often hidden from the public eye until the right time. Our job is to trust the process, stay faithful in the small things, and wait for the moment when our calling is revealed to the world. David's patience and faith in God's timing are qualities we can all aspire to. David's showdown with Goliath is one of those stories that transcends time. It's a moment that, on the surface, seems impossible. A young boy standing up against a seasoned warrior, a giant feared by even the bravest of soldiers. But what made David so different? It wasn't his size, strength, or even his skill with a sling. It was his faith. Faith is one of those things that, when tested, reveals our true character. For David, his years of defending his flock from lions and bears weren't just physical preparation, they were spiritual. He learned to trust God in moments of danger, knowing that his strength came from a higher source. Picture the scene, an entire army, trembling in fear, while Goliath taunted them day after day. No one dared to step forward, no one but David. Courage, in its truest form, isn't the absence of fear, it's the decision to act in spite of it. David knew he wasn't facing Goliath alone. That's where his strength came from. Sometimes, we face our own Goliaths, those challenges that seem too big, too overwhelming. And just like David, we have to tap into that source of strength beyond ourselves. What's fascinating is that David didn't rely on traditional armor or weapons. Saul offered him armor, but it didn't fit. David knew that his victory wouldn't come from man-made tools, but from what he already had: a sling, some stones, and his unshakable faith. In life, we often look for external solutions to internal problems. We think that if we had the right job, the right connections, or the right resources, we'd succeed. But David's story teaches us that sometimes, what we already have is enough. It's not about what's in your hand, but what's in your heart. When David stepped onto that battlefield, he didn't do it for fame or glory. He did it because he knew that Goliath was mocking not just Israel but God. His motivation wasn't selfish, it was righteous anger, a desire to defend what was sacred. This is a reminder that when we fight for a cause greater than ourselves, we tap into a courage we didn't know we had. It's easy to stay in our comfort zones, but true growth comes when we step out in faith, even when the odds are stacked against us. Another critical aspect of David's courage was his ability to see beyond the immediate situation. While everyone else focused on Goliath's size and strength, David focused on the bigger picture: God's promise. He knew that the battle wasn't just between him and Goliath, but between God and the forces opposing him. This perspective shift is crucial in our own lives. When we focus on the problem, it can feel insurmountable. But when we focus on God's promises, we realize that no giant is too big for him. David's courage wasn't just a one-time event. It was a habit he had developed over years of trusting God in the small things. It's easy to overlook those quiet moments of preparation, but they're what build our faith for the bigger battles. In our lives, we may not face literal giants, but we do face challenges that feel just as overwhelming. The key is to remember that courage isn't something you muster up in a moment. It's something you cultivate daily, in the small, quiet acts of faith and trust. And here's the part that often gets missed. When David defeated Goliath, it wasn't just his victory, it was a victory for all of Israel. His courage inspired an entire nation to believe again, to fight again. Courage is contagious. When we step out in faith, others are watching, and our actions can inspire them to face their own battles. This is why it's so important to live boldly, not just for ourselves, but for those around us who need that spark of hope. Finally, let's not forget that David didn't just defeat Goliath with physical strength. He used his mind. He knew he couldn't fight Goliath in hand-to-hand combat. He'd lose. So, he used strategy. The sling was an unconventional weapon, but in David's hands, it became the perfect tool for victory. This teaches us that sometimes we have to think outside the box. When facing challenges, don't be afraid to use creative solutions. Just because something hasn't been done before doesn't mean it won't work. David's innovation on the battlefield is a reminder to trust our instincts and be resourceful with what we have. David's rise to fame wasn't something he sought after. He didn't walk onto the battlefield with Goliath thinking, "This is my big break." No, he was simply doing what he believed was right, defending the name of God and protecting his people. And yet, that single act of courage propelled him from an unknown shepherd to a celebrated hero throughout Israel. It's incredible how quickly life can change when we're aligned with our purpose. Sometimes, the things we least expect can become the turning points in our lives. After his victory, David became the talk of the nation. Songs were sung in his honor, and his name was on everyone's lips. But with that fame came unexpected challenges. While the people adored him, there was one person whose admiration quickly turned into jealousy: King Saul. It's a pattern we see often in life, isn't it? Success attracts attention, and not all of it is positive. David's fame triggered something in Saul, a deep-seated insecurity that would shape the rest of their relationship. Jealousy is a powerful emotion, and for Saul, it was all-consuming. He saw David not just as a brave warrior but as a threat to his throne. The irony is that David had no intention of taking Saul's place, at least not then. He was content to serve under Saul, but Saul's paranoia and envy clouded his judgment. This is a valuable lesson for all of us. When we allow jealousy to take root, it distorts our perspective and can lead us to act irrationally. For David, the sudden shift from national hero to fugitive must have been jarring. One minute, he's being celebrated. The next, he's running for his life. But even in this, there's a lesson. Fame and success can be fleeting, and our true character is revealed not in the moments of victory but in how we handle adversity. David didn't let Saul's jealousy derail him. He remained focused on his purpose and trusted that God's plan would unfold in time. It's interesting to think about how David's fame affected his relationships. On the one hand, it opened doors for him, connecting him with influential people in Israel. On the other hand, it created enemies, most notably Saul. This is something we all face when we achieve success. Not everyone will celebrate with us. Some will feel threatened, and their jealousy can create tension in our lives. The key is not to let that deter us from our path. David's rise to fame also highlights the importance of humility. Despite the songs and accolades, David remained grounded. He didn't let the fame go to his head. Instead, he continued to serve Saul and the people of Israel faithfully. This humility is what set him apart from others. Fame can be intoxicating, but it's how we handle it that defines our legacy. David's humility in the face of fame is a reminder that true greatness is found in service, not in accolades. As Saul's jealousy grew, so did his attempts to harm David. But what's remarkable is that even as Saul tried to kill him, David never retaliated. He could have used his newfound influence to turn people against Saul, but he didn't. This restraint speaks to David's character. He understood that his rise to fame wasn't about him, it was about God's plan. He wasn't fighting for his own glory but for something greater. How often do we see people use their influence for personal gain, forgetting the bigger picture? David's fame could have easily led him down a path of arrogance and revenge, but instead, it became a test of his faith and patience. He had to navigate the complexities of success while staying true to his values. It's a delicate balance that many struggle with today. Fame, in itself, isn't bad, but it can be a double-edged sword. David's story reminds us that we must remain grounded in our faith and purpose, no matter how high we rise. Finally, David's rise to fame wasn't just about his victory over Goliath. it was about what came next. The real test of character is how we handle the aftermath of success. For David, it meant navigating Saul's jealousy, staying humble, and trusting that God's plan for his life would unfold in time. This is something we can all apply to our lives. Success will come, but it's how we handle it that truly defines us. Saul's jealousy toward David didn't start all at once. It crept in slowly, like a shadow, growing darker with each victory David secured on the battlefield. At first, Saul was proud to have David in his army, especially after the defeat of Goliath. But as David's success grew, so did the admiration of the people. They saw David as a rising star, and that admiration shifted the spotlight away from Saul, which planted the seeds of resentment. Jealousy is often born out of comparison, and Saul began to see David not as an ally, but as a threat to his reign. It's fascinating to consider how success can become a double-edged sword. For David, each victory brought him closer to the people's hearts, but further away from Saul's favor. Saul couldn't celebrate David's success because he was too busy measuring it against his own. This is a trap many fall into, comparing their achievements with others, rather than appreciating their unique journey. Saul's growing hostility serves as a reminder of how dangerous jealousy can be when left unchecked. David's growing popularity didn't come from a place of ambition. He wasn't seeking to overshadow Saul or take his throne. He was simply doing what he was called to do: serve his people and honor God. Yet, despite his intentions, Saul's insecurities transformed David's success into a perceived threat. This dynamic is something we see in everyday life. Sometimes, no matter how pure our intentions are, others may interpret our success as a challenge to their own status or worth. As Saul's jealousy deepened, he began to take more drastic actions to eliminate David. What started as cold glances and bitter words soon escalated into direct attempts on David's life. For David, this must have been confusing and heartbreaking. After all, he had only ever been loyal to Saul, serving him with dedication and honor. But this is where David's character shines the brightest. Even as Saul turned against him, David never responded with hatred or revenge. His respect for Saul's authority, despite Saul's unjust actions, was unwavering. Imagine being in David's shoes, having to constantly look over your shoulder, not because of enemies on the battlefield, but because the very king you served now wanted you dead. David was thrust into a life on the run, forced to leave behind his home and the people who admired him. Yet, even in this difficult season, David didn't lose sight of who he was or what he stood for. He remained patient, trusting that God had a plan, even if it wasn't clear in the moment. Saul's jealousy also reveals a deeper truth about leadership and power. True leaders don't feel threatened by the success of others. They celebrate it. Saul's inability to do this ultimately led to his downfall. He was so consumed with holding onto his power that he lost sight of what made him a good leader in the first place: serving his people. In contrast, David's humility and ability to serve, even when he was being wronged, set him apart as the true leader Israel needed. David's time as a fugitive was not just about survival. It was a season of preparation. While Saul saw him as a rival to be eliminated, God was shaping David into the king he would eventually become. It's a powerful reminder that sometimes our hardest seasons are actually times of growth and refinement. David didn't see his time on the run as a punishment, but as a part of his journey. And in our own lives, when we face adversity, it's important to remember that these moments can be shaping us for something greater. The relationship between David and Saul also speaks to the complex nature of human emotions. Saul wasn't purely evil, nor was David completely without flaws. They were both men with strengths and weaknesses, shaped by their experiences and emotions. Saul's jealousy, while destructive, was rooted in fear and insecurity, emotions that many of us have felt at some point. Understanding this helps us see that jealousy, while natural, becomes dangerous when it goes unchecked and dictates our actions. Finally, Saul's jealousy marked the beginning of David's long journey as a fugitive, but it was also the beginning of his deeper reliance on God. Without the safety of the palace or the approval of the king, David had to place his trust entirely in God's protection and plan. This phase of his life, though painful, deepened his faith and prepared him for the responsibility of leading a nation. It's a reminder that even in our darkest seasons, there is purpose. And just as David found strength in his faith, we too can find strength in trusting that our struggles are not in vain. In the midst of the tension between David and Saul, an unlikely and powerful friendship blossomed: David and Jonathan. Their bond wasn't just a casual friendship. It was something much deeper, rooted in mutual respect, loyalty, and a shared understanding of God's greater plan. Jonathan, Saul's son, had every reason to be jealous of David. After all, David was the one destined to take the throne, the very position Jonathan could have aspired to inherit. But instead of harboring resentment, Jonathan recognized David's divine calling and chose to support him, even at great personal cost. Jonathan's loyalty to David is a rare and beautiful example of true friendship. He didn't let family ties or personal ambition get in the way of doing what was right. In fact, Jonathan's willingness to stand by David, even when it meant going against his own father, shows a level of selflessness that is hard to come by. It's a reminder that true friendship isn't about what we can gain from one another, but about supporting each other's purpose, even when it requires sacrifice. For David, Jonathan was more than just a friend. He was a lifeline. At a time when Saul's jealousy was spiraling out of control, Jonathan acted as a buffer, protecting David from his father's wrath. It's easy to imagine the emotional strain this must have caused Jonathan. On one hand, he loved his father, but on the other, he knew that David was chosen by God to lead Israel. This internal conflict speaks to the complexity of human relationships. Sometimes, we're faced with difficult choices that force us to balance loyalty to family with loyalty to truth. Jonathan's actions also highlight the importance of discernment in relationships. He could see beyond the immediate circumstances and recognize that David was destined for something greater. This discernment allowed him to act wisely, even when it wasn't easy. In our own lives, having friends like Jonathan, people who can see our potential and support us in our calling, can make all the difference. True friends don't just stand by us when things are easy. They walk with us through the storms, guiding us and protecting us when necessary. One of the most touching aspects of Jonathan and David's friendship is the covenant they made with each other. This wasn't just a promise of friendship, it was a solemn agreement that they would look out for each other and their descendants. This level of commitment goes beyond the typical bonds of friendship. It's a reflection of their deep trust and respect for one another, as well as their understanding that their destinies were intertwined. This covenant is a reminder that true friendship is built on trust and a commitment to support each other's growth. The story of Jonathan and David also challenges us to think about our own relationships. How often do we prioritize personal gain over the well-being of others? Jonathan's willingness to step aside and let David fulfill his destiny is a powerful example of humility and selflessness. He didn't view David's success as a threat to his own worth, but as a part of God's greater plan. This kind of humility is rare, but it's something we can all strive for in our relationships. David's friendship with Jonathan wasn't just about survival, it was about strengthening each other's faith. Jonathan believed in David's calling even when David himself may have doubted it. Having someone in your life who believes in you, especially when you're facing challenges, can make all the difference. Jonathan's faith in David was a constant source of encouragement, helping him stay focused on the bigger picture. In our own lives, we can be that source of faith and encouragement for others, reminding them of their potential and the purpose they've been called to. As Saul's jealousy grew more dangerous, Jonathan's role in protecting David became even more critical. On several occasions, Jonathan risked his own life to warn David of Saul's plans. This kind of sacrificial love is the hallmark of true friendship. Jonathan wasn't just looking out for himself, he was willing to lay everything on the line for the sake of his friend. This selflessness is something we can aspire to in our own relationships. It's not always easy, but true friendship often requires us to put the needs of others before our own. Finally, Jonathan's friendship with David shows us that even in the darkest times, God places people in our lives to help us along the way. David's journey wasn't easy, but having Jonathan by his side made all the difference. In moments of doubt, fear, and uncertainty, we need people who will stand with us, remind us of our calling, and help us stay the course. Jonathan's friendship was a gift from God, a reminder that we are never truly alone in our battles. David's exile was not just a physical journey, it was a deeply spiritual one as well. Forced to flee for his life because of Saul's relentless pursuit, David was thrust into a period of intense hardship and isolation. Living on the run, with enemies all around him, David had to rely on his instincts and, more importantly, on his faith. It's in these moments of adversity that true character is revealed, and for David, this time of exile became a crucible where his leadership skills were sharpened and his dependence on God deepened. Imagine being in David's shoes, constantly moving from place to place, never knowing where the next threat might come from. and always looking over your shoulder. It would have been easy for him to grow bitter, to question why God had allowed this to happen after promising him the throne. But David's exile wasn't about punishment, it was about preparation. God was using this time to shape him into the leader he would one day become. In our own lives, we often face seasons of difficulty where it seems like everything is going wrong, but those moments can be the very times when we grow the most. During his time in exile, David gathered a group of loyal followers, men who were drawn to his leadership despite his precarious situation. These men weren't the elite of society. They were outcasts, people who had been marginalized. Yet, under David's leadership, they became a formidable force. This teaches us a valuable lesson about leadership. It's not about the status of those who follow you, but about the ability to inspire and unite them toward a common purpose. David's ability to rally these men, despite their circumstances, shows the kind of leader he was becoming. David's time in exile was also a lesson in humility. He had been anointed as the future king of Israel, but here he was, living in caves and hiding in the wilderness. It's a stark contrast, isn't it? Sometimes, the path to greatness isn't glamorous. It's filled with setbacks and struggles. But it's in those moments of humility that we learn the most about ourselves and our reliance on God. For David, this season was about stripping away the comforts of life and focusing on what truly mattered, his faith and his calling. One of the most remarkable aspects of David's exile is how he maintained his integrity throughout. Despite having multiple opportunities to kill Saul and take the throne by force, David refused. He recognized that leadership isn't something to be grasped through violence or manipulation. It's something that comes in God's timing. This patience and respect for authority, even when it was unjust, is a powerful example for all of us. How often do we try to force things to happen on our own terms, rather than waiting for the right moment? In exile, David also learned the importance of community. Though he was on the run, he wasn't alone. His band of followers became a source of support and strength for him. It's a reminder that even in our darkest times, we need people around us who can lift us up and share the burden. David's ability to foster loyalty and camaraderie among his men was crucial to his survival and success. Leadership isn't just about vision. It's about creating a community where people feel valued and supported. Another key lesson from David's time in exile is resilience. He faced constant danger, uncertainty, and betrayal, yet he never gave up. This resilience wasn't just a result of his own strength. It came from his trust in God. David knew that, no matter how bleak the situation seemed, God was with him and had a plan for his life. In our own lives, when we face difficult seasons, it's easy to lose hope. But David's story reminds us that resilience comes from trusting in something greater than ourselves. David's exile also provided him with a unique perspective on leadership. He experienced firsthand what it was like to be an outcast, to be hunted and misunderstood. This gave him a deep empathy for the people he would one day lead. It's easy for leaders to become disconnected from the struggles of those they serve, but David's years in exile kept him grounded. He knew what it was like to be on the margins, and this understanding made him a more compassionate and effective leader when he eventually took the throne. Finally, David's exile was a time of deep spiritual growth. Without the distractions of palace life, he had to rely on God in ways he hadn't before. His prayers during this time, many of which are recorded in the Psalms, reflect a man who was desperate for God's guidance and protection. This season of spiritual refinement prepared David for the immense responsibility of leading a nation. It's a reminder that, in our own times of exile, whether literal or figurative, God is often doing his greatest work in us, preparing us for what's to come. One of the most striking aspects of David's story is his unwavering respect for Saul's authority, even when it would have been so easy, and perhaps justifiable, for David to take matters into his own hands. Twice, David found himself in a position where he could have ended Saul's life and seized the throne. And yet, both times, David held back. His reason. He knew that Saul had been appointed by God, and even though Saul was acting unjustly, David refused to harm someone who had been anointed by God. In today's world, where authority is often questioned and undermined, David's respect for Saul is a powerful example of humility and trust in God's timing. It would have been easy for David to justify killing Saul. After all, Saul had repeatedly tried to kill him, and David was the rightful heir to the throne. But David understood something profound. Just because you have the opportunity to do something doesn't mean you should. There's a difference between what is possible and what is right, and David chose the latter. David's restraint is even more impressive when you consider the pressure he must have been under. His men encouraged him to kill Saul, telling him that God had delivered Saul into his hands. It would have been tempting to listen to those voices, to take the easy way out. But David knew that shortcuts rarely lead to lasting success. He understood that true leadership requires patience, integrity, and a commitment to doing what is right, even when it's difficult. This respect for authority wasn't about agreeing with Saul's actions. In fact, David had every reason to despise Saul. But David's respect for Saul wasn't based on Saul's behavior. It was based on David's reverence for God. He knew that God had placed Saul in his position, and it wasn't David's place to remove him. This level of respect for authority, even in the face of injustice, is something that is rare today. But it's a reminder that true respect is about honoring the position and trusting God to handle the outcome, even when we don't understand it. David's decision to spare Saul's life wasn't just an act of mercy, it was an act of faith. By choosing not to kill Saul, David was placing his trust in God's timing and plan. He could have taken the throne by force, but instead, he waited for God to fulfill his promise in his own time. This is a powerful lesson for all of us. How often do we try to force things to happen on our own schedule, instead of waiting for God's timing? David's story teaches us that patience and faith are often the keys to receiving what we've been promised. Another important aspect of David's respect for authority is the way it shaped his leadership. By choosing not to kill Saul, David demonstrated that he was a different kind of leader, one who valued justice, mercy, and faith over power and control. This made him the kind of leader that people could trust and follow. In our own lives, we can learn from David's example by seeking to lead with integrity and humility, even when we're in positions of power. David's respect for Saul also highlights the importance of forgiveness. Even though Saul had wronged him repeatedly, David didn't hold a grudge. He didn't seek revenge or harbor bitterness. Instead, he showed mercy and grace. This is a challenging example for all of us. How often do we hold on to grudges, even when we have the power to let go? David's story reminds us that forgiveness is a powerful tool for healing and growth, both for ourselves and for those around us. In sparing Saul's life, David also set an example for his men. They saw firsthand what true leadership looked like. They saw that leadership isn't about taking what you want, but about doing what is right, even when it's hard. David's actions spoke louder than any words could have, and they earned him the respect and loyalty of his followers. This is a valuable lesson for anyone in a position of leadership. Your actions set the tone for those who follow you. If you lead with integrity, others will follow. Lastly, David's respect for authority wasn't just about his relationship with Saul. It was about his relationship with God. By sparing Saul, David was demonstrating his trust in God's sovereignty. He believed that God was in control, even when things didn't make sense. This trust allowed David to stay calm and focused, even in the face of adversity. It's a reminder for us that no matter what challenges we face, we can trust that God is in control, and that his plan is always better than anything we could imagine. David's journey to the throne was long and filled with trials, but when the time finally came, it wasn't just a personal victory. It was the fulfillment of God's promise. After years of running from Saul, enduring exile, and leading a band of misfits, David was finally anointed as king over Israel. This moment wasn't just about David's rise to power. It was about God's faithfulness. Every step of David's journey, from shepherd to king, had been orchestrated by God. And now, the promise was fulfilled. When David became king, he didn't immediately rule over a united Israel. In fact, there was still division among the tribes. But David, with his leadership skills honed during years of hardship, was able to unite the nation. This wasn't just a political move, it was a spiritual one. David understood that his role as king wasn't just to govern the people, but to lead them back to God. His kingship was a reflection of his deep relationship with God, and he sought to honor him in all that he did. One of David's most significant achievements as king was the establishment of Jerusalem as the capital of Israel. This decision wasn't just strategic, it was symbolic. Jerusalem was not only to be the political center of the nation but also its spiritual heart. David's vision for Jerusalem was that it would be a place where the presence of God dwelled among his people. This was more than just a move of governance. It was a declaration that Israel was a nation under God's rule. David's leadership as king was marked by humility and a deep sense of responsibility. He never forgot where he came from, the fields of Bethlehem where he once tended sheep. This grounding in humility allowed him to rule with compassion and wisdom. He wasn't a perfect king, but his heart was always aligned with God's purpose. This is a powerful reminder that leadership isn't about being flawless. It's about staying connected to the values and mission that drive you. The unification of Israel under David's reign was no small feat. The nation had been divided, and tensions ran high among the tribes. But David's leadership brought peace and stability. He didn't achieve this through force or manipulation, but through wisdom, patience, and a genuine desire to see the nation flourish. His ability to bring people together is a testament to the power of servant leadership, putting the needs of others above your own desires for power or recognition. David's reign also marked a period of spiritual renewal for Israel. He was deeply committed to bringing the people back to a place of worship and reverence for God. One of his first acts as king was to bring the Ark of the Covenant to Jerusalem, signifying that God's presence would be central to the life of the nation. This wasn't just a religious act. It was a statement that Israel's strength and success came from their relationship with God. David's leadership reminded the people that their identity as a nation was rooted in their covenant with God. As David established Jerusalem as the spiritual and political capital, he also laid the groundwork for future generations. His reign set the stage for the construction of the temple, a project that his son Solomon would later complete. David may not have built the temple himself, but his vision and leadership were instrumental in making it possible. This teaches us that true leadership isn't just about what we accomplish in our own lifetime. It's about what we set in motion for those who come after us. David's kingship wasn't without challenges. He faced opposition, betrayal, and personal failure. But through it all, he remained steadfast in his trust in God. His ability to lead through adversity, while staying grounded in his faith, is a powerful example for us today. Leadership isn't about avoiding difficulties. It's about navigating them with grace, wisdom, and a commitment to something greater than ourselves. Finally, David's reign as king was a reflection of God's heart for his people. David wasn't chosen because he was perfect. He was chosen because of his heart. And despite his mistakes, he always returned to God in repentance and humility. This is what made David a man after God's own heart. His kingship wasn't about his own glory. It was about pointing the people back to God, the true King of Israel. David's reign was characterized by a balance of wisdom and leadership, which often seemed at odds with the expectations of the world. As a leader, he didn't just focus on military conquests or political power. His priority was fostering unity among the tribes of Israel and strengthening their faith in God. This wasn't easy, especially in a time when divisions ran deep. But David, grounded in his experience as a shepherd, approached leadership with the heart of a servant, always seeking what was best for his people rather than for himself. One of David's greatest strengths was his ability to listen to wise counsel. He wasn't the type of leader who pretended to have all the answers. Instead, he surrounded himself with people who could guide him in making difficult decisions. His relationship with the prophet Nathan, for example, was crucial in keeping him accountable. Leaders who are open to advice, and who admit their own limitations, often build stronger teams and make wiser choices in the long run. David's humility in seeking counsel set a precedent for leadership that values wisdom over ego. David's decision to bring the Ark of the Covenant to Jerusalem was both a political and spiritual act, symbolizing the centrality of God's presence in the life of Israel. In doing so, David reminded the people that their success as a nation was not based on military might or political alliances, but on their covenant with God. This act of devotion helped unify the tribes under a common purpose and reinforce the idea that Israel was a nation set apart, with God at its center. Even in moments of personal failure, David's leadership showed his true character. When confronted with his sin, particularly in the case of Bathsheba, David didn't try to justify his actions or hide from the truth. Instead, he showed deep repentance, accepting responsibility for his actions and seeking forgiveness from God. This willingness to admit mistakes and seek reconciliation is what made David not only a great leader but also a man after God's own heart. Leadership isn't about being perfect. It's about how you respond when you fall short. David's leadership also had a long-lasting impact on future generations. His vision for Israel as a unified, God-centered nation laid the groundwork for the reign of his son Solomon, who would go on to build the temple in Jerusalem. David may not have been perfect, but his legacy is one of faith, humility, and a deep understanding of what it means to lead with wisdom. His life reminds us that true leadership is not about personal glory, but about serving others and honoring God. David's legacy is one that stretches far beyond his reign as king. His influence can still be felt today, not just in religious contexts but in leadership and personal growth lessons as well. What made David unique was his ability to connect with both God and his people in a way that fostered deep loyalty and reverence. His heart for God, even in his moments of failure, shaped the future of Israel and left a lasting mark on generations to come. One of the key aspects of David's legacy was his emphasis on worship. David didn't just lead through military might or political strategy. He led through worship, constantly pointing the people back to God as the source of their strength. His establishment of Jerusalem as the spiritual center of Israel was a monumental decision that reinforced the importance of faith in the daily lives of the people. Worship wasn't just a personal practice for David, it was a national priority, one that defined his reign and set a standard for future leaders. David's Psalms are perhaps one of the most enduring aspects of his legacy. These songs of praise, lament, and worship have been a source of comfort and inspiration for countless generations. In them, we see the full range of human emotion: joy, sorrow, repentance, and hope. David's willingness to be vulnerable before God, to pour out his heart in both good times and bad, is what makes his Psalms so relatable. They serve as a reminder that faith isn't about perfection, but about an honest relationship with God. His legacy also extends to his role as a forerunner of the Messiah. In the New Testament, Jesus is often referred to as the Son of David, highlighting the messianic lineage that began with David's kingship. This connection between David and Jesus underscores the significance of David's life in the grand narrative of the Bible. His reign was not just about political success, but about setting the stage for the ultimate fulfillment of God's promise through Christ. Finally, David's legacy teaches us that leadership is about more than power or success. It's about leaving a lasting impact that transcends our own lifetime. David wasn't a perfect leader, but his faith, humility, and devotion to God created a foundation that would influence Israel for generations. His story reminds us that our greatest contributions often come through our faithfulness to God and our willingness to lead with humility and integrity. As you've journeyed through David's incredible story, you've witnessed how an ordinary shepherd became a king, how he faced overwhelming challenges, and how he turned his greatest failures into opportunities for growth. But what about you? What giants are you facing in your life right now? And, more importantly, how are you preparing to overcome them? David's life reminds us that true greatness doesn't come from avoiding mistakes, but from how we rise after we fall. Are you ready to embrace that lesson in your own life? Now is the time to apply what you've learned. Whether it's taking a step of faith in a difficult situation or choosing to forgive when it feels impossible, David's example shows us that with God's help, no obstacle is too great to conquer. So, what will your next move be? Will you allow fear and doubt to hold you back, or will you step forward in faith, knowing that God is with you just as he was with David? Take a moment to reflect on the areas of your life where you need courage, wisdom, or forgiveness, and then take action. Start small if you must, but start. If this story has inspired you, don't stop here. There's so much more to learn, and we're here to walk with you on that journey. Be sure to subscribe to the channel, hit the notification bell, and stay tuned for more lessons that will help you grow in faith and wisdom. Let's continue to learn from David's life, and from each other, as we walk this path together.